So one of the hot topics of the Computex last week is this new competition heating up against Nvidia's NVLink. This is called the UALink, led by AMD, Intel, and a coalition of a lot of big companies like Microsoft and Meta and Google as well, and also others. So what is this UALink and what is gonna do? So UALink is the competition to Nvidia's own version NVLink. It's basically the system that where you buy all these AI GPUs that everyone talks about. You know, you might have heard about H100, H200, or AMD's MI300X. And when these big companies buy all these servers, they buy like hundreds, thousands, or tens of thousands of these chips. And they need to communicate with each other. And this is going to happen with NVLink or in the future with the UALink for other companies. And you might think, okay, how important is this? Well, in Nvidia's latest quarter, they had, I think, 22.5 billion in sales for the entire data center segment. 19 billion roughly was from the pure GPU, so like the H100. And the rest, so around 3 billion, was for the NVLink and the other stuff. So it's still a big part, you know. I mean, if you take 3 billion times 4, that's 12 billion annual run rate in a market that's growing, obviously. And that's like half of Nvidia's, half of AMD's revenue last year for the entire company. So this is nothing, you know, to sneeze at. And I think this is a very important news coming from Computex last week, and especially considering these names that are in there. So this is gonna definitely help to open up the market a bit more. A market where Nvidia right now has 95% of the, let's say, sales. Another big thing is, you know, TSMC. Everyone in this, segment knows that TSMC is one of the most important, if not the most important company there. And they are essentially saying, okay, Nvidia, you know, we sell you these chips, we manufacture it for you, and we sell it to you for a couple of $1,000s. And then you go out and sell these chips for like 30,000 US dollar to your customers. So essentially, TSMC is saying, okay, so why do you get to have like 90%, 80% gross margins on something that we manufacture for you? Maybe we should agree on a more fairer deal. Like, you know, I don't know, maybe TSMC wants 10-15% high in gross margin themselves. And who's like disagreeing with that? Because if you look at this, like Nvidia is a $3 trillion company, whereas TSMC is 857. So that's like 4 times less. And most people, I think, would agree that TSMC on a global stage is more important than Nvidia. I mean, if Nvidia disappears, AMD and Intel have products that are going to essentially do roughly the same thing. But if TSMC disappears, there's no one that's going to, you know, be able to carry the load. Of course, Intel has their own fab, but they don't have the capacity or the technical edge right now to replace the highest end of the chips that TSMC manufactures. And you can actually see that. So if you look at this is my Excel sheet on the nodes over the past decade, and you can see that TSMC is the pink and Intel is the blue, and they've been the 2 dominant players on semiconductor manufacturing over the past decade. But TSMC has gone from, you know, being the second player or even third behind Samsung to be the dominant player. And in like 2020, with the 5 nanometer, they were way ahead of Intel. This is also why Intel had such a big issues, both on their, you know, their CPU designs, but also on their manufacturing capacity and knowledge. But the interesting part is that I think the worst case scenario for Intel was in 2020 and 2021. But now it kind of looks like things are getting more fairer and more even. You could argue that Intel is ahead of TSMC by next year in some regards. They have this thing called backside power delivery, which TSMC will only introduce a year after Intel. So there's definitely some stuff that is, getting closer for Intel compared to TSMC. Now, it's difficult to say, honestly, like if you can trust Intel with their past 4 or 5 years. They tend to promise a lot and fall short of that promise. But I do believe the comparison between these two companies' manufacturing capacity and technology is much more closer now than it was in, let's say, pandemic times in 2020. So why is that important? Well, it's gonna help Intel, for example. They're gonna be able to do better products. That's gonna I mean, you might have heard about Intel's Gaudi. Gaudi is like the Intel lineup that they have compared to Nvidia and AMD's AI server GPUs. They are promising about 500 million in sales this year, so it's nothing compared to Nvidia. That's what Nvidia sells in a couple of days. But the important thing here is that I think the biggest mistake people make is to look at, like, for example, this 500 million for Intel for the entire year of 2024, and they don't consider the fact that they had maybe 18 months delay behind Nvidia, so they haven't hit their volume production. Now obviously I don't expect them to ramp up to these kind of levels, but maybe in 2025 you could see a couple of billion or 3 billion. And then the same scenario for AMD, but I would say that AMD was 1 year behind Nvidia roughly and 1 year ahead of Intel. And you can see that 500 million that Intel is gonna sell this year, AMD sold latest quarter in 2023. And now I think most estimates are 4 to 5 billion for the full year, and I've gone with 5.35 billion in sales for their MI300 mostly. And you can see that I've written here MI325X by Q4, which is the updated memory system added to the MI300, which already compared to Nvidia's H100 and H200 had a significant, memory capacity advantage. And that's definitely gonna help AMD's chips in some important workloads in AI. So when people mention AI, you have your inferencing and you have your training. So first you have to train your model, and then you have to send it out for people to use. For example, if you go to ChatGPT and ask a couple of questions, and then the answer that it gives you back, then that's basically the inferencing, and if I understand it correctly. And that's where AMD has its advantage compared to Nvidia. Now, by Q4 this year, they announced on Computex last week, Nvidia, that they're gonna announce their B100, the Blackwell series. They're gonna equal the AMD memory capacity then. But then I think in late Q4, so maybe 1 quarter after Nvidia kind of equals the memory capacity at least, then the AMD is gonna introduce the MI325X, and that one is gonna be again 1 leg up compared to Blackwell in that regard. Blackwell is better in some other parts, because if you go to AnandTech, we can see that AMD is introducing FP4 and FP6 with the MI350, so the successor to the 325, which is going to be launching, last quarter this year. MI350 is going to be launching in 2025. We don't know when. My suspicion is that it's in the second half, but hopefully it's going to be in the first half. But that's going to be on the 3 nanometer node, so it's on a much more improved node compared to the Blackwell at least. Question is, which node is going to be Nvidia's successor to Blackwell, which is the Rubin, which they also announced. But yeah, the important part there is that they're going to introduce FP4 and FP6. And you might wonder, why is that important? Well, you can see here, this is only Nvidia's lineup from the A100, the Ampere, H100 Hopper, and then Blackwell. And you can see that, what does it mean? So the FP16, Int 8, and so these are different precisions, I believe. So you have FP64, which is very important in HPC, high performance computing. That is also where AMD has an advantage. So again, the MI300 here is a very good, is much better than Nvidia's equivalent in HPC, because when it comes to FP64, this chip is much more stronger than H100 and H200. But for the AI, the precision is not as, let's say FP64 and 32 is not as important. If I'm not a data scientist, but all I understood is that, you need this FP16, FP8 and FP6 and so on. So the difference between FP64 and, let's say FP8 is the precision, which means that you're gonna do the same, much more amount of calculations for the same amount of power. But you lose your precision. But you don't need precision in AI, in inferencing and in training. So that's why, they're gonna keep going down into lower and lower precision. And you can see that with Blackwell, they're gonna introduce FP6 and FP4 late this year. Now AMD is gonna announce that next year. with the MI350. So yeah, it's a bit interesting because I think Nvidia will have the edge, the advantage in training late this year, and AMD is going to continue to have the advantage in inferencing to some degree. But also, the market is so big, so for Nvidia to lose a couple of percentage here and there, it's actually a lot of money for AMD. Because look at this 5 billion here, it's like 25% of AMD's revenue last year. And this is high margin revenue. Now, nowhere near Nvidia's margin, because why? Because they are selling it at twice the price that AMD is selling roughly. Again, this is our estimates, but I think most people agree that AMD is selling it at lower price than Nvidia by quite a margin. But if let's say if we assume 800 million of revenue for AMD with MI300 for Q2, so in this current quarter, and at an average selling price of $15,000, you're gonna get roughly 53,000 chips. So compare that Q2 to Nvidia's, yeah, it's a factor of 10 to 15. And doing this train of thought, you can see that by the end of the year, in Q4, Nvidia is gonna make 900,000 of those. The Blackwells, let's say mostly, probably B100 and 200s. And AMD is gonna make 160 of MI325Xs and MI300s. If this is optimistic, possibly I would think like the number is around 100 to 150,000. But I think that AMD is kind of lowballing their numbers a bit. So that's why I just assumed 2.4. But it could be closer to 2 and 1.5. But the idea is that like we can see that although the revenue-wise, look at this, the revenue difference between Q4 for each company is more than 10 times, but the number of units delivered is less than 10 times, and that's because that AMD sells them at lower price. And this is important because sure, in the short term for the stock price, it's better obviously to have higher revenue, but AMD is trying to gain market share, so they have to sell it at lower sales price and get their chips out there in significant numbers. And by Q4, even if it's only, let's say 100,000, so let's say I'm way too optimistic here, and they only sell 100,000 MI300 series totally, it's essentially one ninth of the Nvidia's number of H200 and B100 chips. So that's a factor of 9 to 1, which means that AMD has around 11 to 12% of the market by end of this year. And I think that's very important because they're going to be able to add to that maybe next year again. And if they are getting to 20-25% of market share in middle of 2026 or late 2026, I don't think Nvidia will be able to have these kind of average selling prices. And that's going to obviously affect the stock price because sure, possibly that the market in its entirety is growing, but then you have also Intel coming into by 2026, my suspicion is if not everything goes wrong on Intel, they're gonna also have maybe 5-10 billion in AI data centers, and AMD maybe 20 billion. So Intel and AMD could end 2026 with like 25-30% combined and leave Nvidia with 70% market share instead of 95 or 99 which they had last year. So that's gonna I think affect the market positioning and the stock value of Nvidia, because I do not believe that the gaming segment for Nvidia is gonna be nowhere near good enough. I mean, last quarter they had like 2.7 billion in gaming revenue, and they don't have nowhere near enough margins on that. And especially on gaming GPUs, that's a market that has been shrinking for the past 2 decades. So sure, Nvidia has like 85% market share there in the gaming GPUs. But come on, it's a decreasing market that gets smaller and smaller, and at some point the laptop GPUs, which Intel and AMD are really good at now, with Meteor Lake and Phoenix and Strix Point, they're gonna more people. For example, myself, I had a stationary computer for over the past 10 years, and last year I changed to a laptop because this laptop is gonna do all the work I need, the editing, the gaming, and that's good enough. And I don't want, the big chunk of stuff sitting there consuming 300 watts and making the room like a sauna. So I think most people are getting closer to that conclusion as well. So yeah, gaming revenue is not going to save Nvidia. They have to hold these kind of numbers essentially forever in order for the market to not collapse, the market cap. So yeah, I think you should be cautious with Nvidia, and you've seen in the early beginnings of the video that TSMC raising some concerns. We know that there's competition coming in form of not only AMD and Intel. I mean, it's Broadcom, it's Cisco, it's Apple, it's Meta. We also know that from other news that, you know, Meta and Microsoft say that they will buy AMD's new AI chip as an alternative to Nvidia's. December 6th last year. And that's, you know, that's when AMD had few thousands, tens of thousands of MI300 compared to Nvidia's. Let's have a look at it again so you can see that, yeah, Nvidia last year in Q3 probably was selling 400,000-500,000 units. AMD was selling like 20,000-30,000 units. And but already then these companies like, you know, Lenovo say the demand for AMD is very high. And you would probably see the same thing with Intel. And just to end the video with Intel, which will be my next video as well, I think it's very important to have a, you know, don't forget Intel, because their positioning in the manufacturing side, which is the driving force in all these chip manufacturers, it's getting stronger. Maybe they won't surpass TSMC, at least for the closest 5 years, but I think they're closing the gap. And that's gonna, you know, give some opportunity compared to AMD, but especially Nvidia, because Nvidia is so now dependent on the AI revenue to coming in. But if Intel can manufacture their own chips, and, you know, maybe they could, like, you know, selling these chips at, let's change this to 10,000. So they could, you know, go to the customer and say that we're gonna sell it at roughly the same chip as Nvidia and AMD, but for 10,000. Why could they do that? Well, they manufacture their own, so they don't have to pay extra margin to manufacturers like, you know, these two other companies have to do. They have to buy it from TSMC. TSMC said they want to make more money, so they have to obviously increase their margins, TSMC. And that margin increase is gonna definitely cut Nvidia's and affect AMD to some degree, I guess. But yeah, so this is not to scare Nvidia investors, but I honestly think, like, you know, it's, yeah, you have to really trust that the AI market is growing at least for 3, 4, 5 more years at this insane pace in order to justify this valuation. On the paper right now, the price to earnings ratio looks very solid, nothing to worry about. But again, think about what could happen if AMD and Intel can start to claw back some market share here. So yeah, thanks for watching and see you in the next one.